to the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. Dr. Steve Wood here with On-Site in El Paso. Once again, another on-site podcast.
Another Hilton property.
Another Hilton property. Dr. Bill Kanasky is joining me. Bill, how are you? Good. I'm glad you could take some time off your speaking tour to.
I'm very aggravated, and I'm going to let you tell the story. You get here, go to the hotel gym, and
it's under renovation.
That's not good.
No.
I was not informed of this before I booked my room here at the DoubleTree. So I guess maybe my body needs some rest days.
Maybe it was the world telling you it's time to take some time off.
It is, but we love El Paso. We are happy to be here. Not an easy place to get to for me. You a little bit different.
Yeah, it's a little bit easy for me, but while we're spending our time here in El Paso, we decided to catch up with friend of the podcast, Lara from the Rincon Law Group. Oscar, how are you? Thanks for joining the podcast.
How's it going, guys? Thanks for having me.
It's good. I mean, I'm glad to finally get a chance. We've been talking about getting you on the podcast, and so I'm glad we were able to get you on here. And I think today Bill and I had talked about kind of what topics we wanted to talk to, and I think you're a perfect one to bring this up because you have a lot of experience with it. We're talking translators, with translating for witnesses who obviously are not native English speakers or who are more comfortable testifying in Spanish. Kind of what have been your experiences as far as that goes of dealing with witnesses who don't speak English or not comfortable speaking English and having to kind of the process of that?
Well, for us, it's a bit of a dynamic because El Paso is 80% Hispanic with like a large Mexican contingency and a lot of them are fairly native Spanish speakers. I'm fluent in Spanish, and so I'm able to converse with them. And so I do a lot of my preps when that arrives in Spanish, and I talk to them in Spanish. I get their confidence in Spanish, and but we have to go through that in English. And so we do our mock prep questions. We have to get somebody. We actually have to hire an interpreter so that when we do the mock questions, the mock deposition, I'm asking the questions in English. They need to be translated from English to Spanish, and then the witness needs to answer in Spanish, and it needs to be translated in English. And at least in El Paso, that's never really too much of an issue because we do have quite a bit of interpreters, but ultimately, though, we have to make sure that interpreter that we hire isn't going to be the one isn't going to be the interpreter for the deposition on that day.
Yeah, they can't actually be it, right? You can't have them be the same one. So it's not like that translator can come in and help with your prep.
Exactly. It cannot, because we're obviously having an attorney-client, relationship here. We're prepping them. We're telling them, well, we're prepping them. And, it's during that time, we're having our attorney-client communications. I'm like, oh, wait, what's going on? You said this. Wait, why are you saying it like that? Maybe you need to phrase it a little bit differently. And the interpreter hears that. I'm like, well, okay. In the prep, I heard this. I'm like, she's not subject to attorney-client privilege. And
So what's the process of choosing the interpreter, both for prep, but then the actual process of the interpreter for the actual deposition? I had a crazy case in which we did several days of witness prep, brought in our interpreter. Everything went great. This witness goes to the dep, new interpreter comes in, right? Neutral party. And the witness couldn't understand the interpreter. They were getting their signals crossed. And I'm thinking, wait. You have Spanish speaking witness, a Spanish speaking interpreter. Isn't Spanish? So educate us on how there can be a disconnect. Even if you have an interpreter, it may not be a good fit for the witness, even if they both speak Spanish.
well, and oftentimes it's a lot of it is dependent on the court reporter and who's noticing the deposition. So obviously, if we're preparing our witness, it's going to be the plaintiff's attorney who's hiring the court reporter, and we would just notify the court reporter that, hey, look, this is who we hired. But if it's you get these national court reporting firms, they're going to hire a national interpreter, and we just need to tell them, hey, this is somebody who's native in Spanish, but they're of Mexican descent. And if you get somebody, and it's happened where I've been in a deposition where they understand formal Spanish that's straight from, Institute of Spain, and that's how they're trying to interpret it. but they're missing the dialect, and we've had to say no, that's not what he said at all. Like I don't know what you're trying to get at.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting. You were telling me about. You were telling me a story, right, where you actually had that, where you had to interrupt and say, "Wait a second,
yeah,
that's not what he's saying." You're trying to translate and say his comment that he's making on the record is actually not what you're saying it is.
Oh, exactly. Because I mean, and I think at that point it mattered what the witness was saying, was because it went to the specific element of damage. How it was interpreted, it made it seem like, oh, it wasn't a big deal, whereas the or no, like it made it seem like it was a bigger deal than it actually was. Where like I'm like, whoa, that's not what he said, folks. I'm like, wait, he said, I mean, I'm trying to remember exactly, but whatever that witness said, they were trying to convey something else, and somebody who would have been more fluent in or understood that dialect would have understood it.
But do you get pushback from opposing counsel at all when you interject like that, as far as it goes, as far as a translator, and when you're trying to say that's not what he's trying to say, and say, no, maybe that's what he is actually trying to say?
It depends. If the attorney understands Spanish, then they're going to say, I agree, but if they don't, there's going to be some pushback because they don't know. They think that I'm trying to pull a fast one or something. And that's always going to be the difficulty. And, that's why it's being recorded. So we got to make sure everything corresponds. But that's always kind of the difficulty thing, because, and especially if you have, like I'll use El Paso, a lot of the West Texas region, is some of these people are, lower class people, like, hardworking blue collar workers. So they're not going to have like this formal Spanish. They're going to be talking like how they talk normally. They talk casually, and that doesn't always translate to a formal response.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's something I do not have an appreciation for, because I don't speak Spanish. I certainly don't look Spanish. Talk to us about because this would have to happen in the courtroom as well, and now you have a jury, staring at you, and it has to be an interesting process. And I know that the famous scene from one of my favorite movies that was on this week. There's certain movies that if I'm scrolling through movies and I hit one of them, like, oh, I gotta watch this. It was My Cousin Vinny.
Right.
And Joe Pesci's like, Your Honor, the two Utes. And they're in Alabama. And he's from Queens. And he's like, excuse me? He's the two Utes. Two what? Two Utes? The two U's, right? I mean, and that's two English people talking. Is it kind of like that? The same thing? It's a different, depending on where you're from and where you're raised, the language on paper may be the same, but maybe in verbal communication we be extraordinarily different.
Oh, it really is. And a lot of it, especially if in the courtroom, it might be a little bit easier, because depending on where the case is pending, you're probably going to get an interpreter that's from that region who's like locally there. But if it's like in a deposition where sometime, and especially like in these Zoom depositions that we're doing, they'll just get an interpreter, and that interpreter may be like, Idaho, like we don't know, they don't know anything, and they may understand like either formal Spanish or they're probably like Puerto Rican or Cuban or Dominican, and their dialects, like the slang that everybody has is just different. And like something that may be nonchalant for a Mexican native speaker may be horribly offensive for a Cuban native speaker and Spanish speaker. And
that's a very good point.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same word and exactly the same phrasing. And we always have to I always make it a point. I'm like, oh, you speak Spanish? I'm like, oh, how did you learn? Like before the deposition, just try to get a little sense. Just like, by the way, this is at least in my case, it's going to be somebody of Mexican descent. So FYI.
Yeah.
Do you find, and I think, Bill, we've seen it too with other people who don't necessarily need an interpreter, but English isn't their formal English.
Issue.
Yeah.
And they choose, and I've been in that situation before where the witness can speak English,
right, but
is scared that they're going to screw something up, so they want the interpreter. Yet if the jury knows it's like, are you trying to hide something? It's kind of an awkward circumstance. So if you're in the position where your witness says, yes, I can speak English, but I'm just more comfortable with Spanish, but you know it's going to be better for your case if they speak English, even if it's broken. What discussion, like, how do you discuss that with your, because I'm sure it's more fear-based that the witness is just more comfortable, yet from the jury perspective, it's going to be much more helpful to a jury, I think, to hear English.
And really a lot of it is depending on where the case is pending. Like,
That's a good point.
because I'll use El Paso as an example. In El Paso, that's, that you encounter that at least pretty routinely, like somebody who clearly understands English.
Yeah.
But I'll use a better example. My dad is understands English, can like watches all of his movies with subtitles in English, and can, but when he speaks it with such a heavy accent that, and sometimes he'll like mix his words. And so like if my dad was ever getting deposed, I'm sure I'd just tell him, just do the deposition in Spanish, because he would probably not convey himself how he would want to in English. Well, I think he understands English perfectly though.
Right. It's that I want to make sure that I'm saying the right thing, because this is a legal proceeding. I don't want to say get caught saying the wrong thing. And in public, if it's just a couple of people sitting around and you say the wrong thing, you can clear it up and it's not a big deal. In a deposition, it's a big deal if you misstate something.
Oh, exactly. And I think especially the difficult thing with that is you have to, well, as you all know, like when you have an interpreter who's doing it, like you ask the question in English, the interpreter has to interpret it from English to Spanish, and then witness has to like listen to it from Spanish to English. And it's so the witness knows what the question is and wants to answer it already, and he's like ready to jump on it, but he's like, oh,
I have to wait.
It's a tedious process, even if you're just watching it on TV. For jurors, I think the demand on jurors is pretty high to have to listen to it, and it doubles the length of the process. Now, so if you have to use an interpreter in trial, I guess, how is that person selected? I've seen it because I've seen some things where the interpreter was a terrible communicator to the jury. And then you're like, okay, so we got this witness that's enthusiastic and passionate with their answer, and they give it in Spanish, and the interpreter gets it and then gives it in a very blah way to the jury, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know. So if there an interpreter's needed, is that something that the court selects, or you maybe submit people you know are good, or how does that process work? Because I'd be uncomfortable if I was an attorney.
We would typically, I mean, if it's our case, we're familiar with some people, with like interpreters who will be great, who know how to convey exactly as best as they can what the witness is saying, like the tone and everything. And regardless of that, we would try to take that interpreter, regardless of where we're having trial. If we have trial in Odessa, hey, come with us. You're coming to Odessa. We're booking your things. Or San Antonio, you're coming with us to San Antonio. You're coming with us to the Rio Grande Valley. But it's the part that actually scares me at times is when the interpretation is sort of being done simultaneously. Like the interpreter is like whispering it into the microphone only, and we're not hearing what the interpreter is saying to the witness or our client. And really that's just done for efficiency purposes, there's not as much delay. But we're wondering, like, wait, did she ask the question correctly, or did he ask the question correctly, or not?
So it takes a lot of trust, obviously, because you're putting the case kind of in the hands of the translator a little bit as far as your witness testimony, right?
Absolutely.
They do something differently.
Right. Well, for purposes of the question not being asked, like, did the interpreter like translate the question properly to the witness?
I think that goes back to, Bill, I think you're saying too, is you get one translator for deposition and one translator for trial. And if there's differences too, you set yourself up for giving a different answer. Then it's like, well, wait a second, in your deposition, you said this. Now you're trying to say this at trial. And it's not an issue of impeachment or them changing their testimony. It's a matter
Lost in
of
translation.
exactly
Yeah.
perfect lost in translation.
Another favorite
analogy.
movie of
Yeah,
mine.
I knew you were going.
Very, very, very sad movie.
Yeah.
I do cry at the end of it. I
Yeah.
just want to let you know. Gonna throw that out. Do you want to transition to the jury selection topic?
Yeah, because I think
this
that's
is very
important.
interesting.
I think it's important. What I do want to talk about when we talk about jury selection in that is I think it's important though to understand also when you talk about jurisdictional differences, right? Because El Paso versus Dallas versus San Antonio versus the Rio Grande, different dialects, different type of people, different type of expectations, different type of all of that. I think so. Like you can't say, oh well, they're Hispanic or they're Mexican, so El Paso, they're going to be a good witness and they're going to be perceived well, but that same witness might not be perceived necessarily the same in San Antonio because you have differences in your jury pool. So can you talk to that a little bit about how kind of the challenges you deal with that? Because as Bill said earlier, like, some people would like to think Hispanic, all Hispanics are the same, which we know is not true, obviously.
I think I think I had a case in Midland like 4 years ago, and I'm taking a jury. And I think the plaintiffs were of Puerto Rican descent, and they were going to use it as Puerto Rican, they were going to use an interpreter because they felt more comfortable. One of the things that's, well, first and foremost, you have to see what the prospective jurors, what their comfort level is, knowing that somebody who lives in their community doesn't fully understand or doesn't fully speak, English, especially if they've lived there for as long time. And then so second, how they're gonna handle this interpretation. Like if they're saying, well, and you quickly realize that some jurors, for the most part, jurors aren't going to be bothered by it that much. But I think if it's going to be different dialects, they may understand it. They're gonna hear it. They know exactly what the response is. And our experience is like when we have like Spanish speaking witnesses testifying on the stand, 60% of the jurors know what's going on, and they don't need to wait for the interpretation. They're like, all right, we got it. Or we're fine, we're good. And then like they'll even pick it up sometimes. Like, yeah, 3 years ago when I was trying a case, I think the interpreter like misinterpreted something. Like I think even the jury, like I was about to like raise my hand, like the jury said, that's not what he said. I was like,
Well, I think we've seen that, right? You talk about that one time that we worked on that case where one of the jurors in our focus group was like, they said that wasn't the question.
Yeah.
That wasn't the question that was asked. But it goes back to, I think, the difference probably in dialect, right? Is
right.
How jurors perceive it and how the jurors perceive that response is if they have a different dialect, the way they see that response might be different, right?
Oh, for sure. Exactly. Yeah.
What's your experience been? Because I think witness testimony or being a defendant is an emotional process for anybody. It's scary, litigation's scary. Do you find that, so immigrants that are Spanish speaking, do they have more of a distrust or fear of the American court system relative to others? We have seen this with many different cultures that they're immigrant. I mean, they're American citizens, but they're not from here. And when they get involved in litigation, their anxiety and fear skyrockets relative to your just normal American-born citizen. Have you seen that? And if so, how do you deal with some of the largely probably irrational fears of that?
Well, one of the first things I do, like I typically see it when we represent some of our truck drivers who we represent a trucking company, and they hire a truck driver who's either from Mexico or from like the border region, and they speak solely Spanish. They're like, they've never been sued, and exactly they have that fear, like, oh my God, am I gonna go to jail, or
am I losing my house,
or am I gonna lose my house? And, I mean, I always like sort of say, I always calm them down. But first of all, like, the company's got your back, and even in Spanish, it's like, we got like insurance. So don't worry, man. Like you're good, man. You're not good. You're things like that, and like gain their trust. And once they realize that like you're helping them out, no matter how adamant they are, like once you gain their trust, like they'll listen to you and they'll be more receptive to you. Then like, okay, all right. Like even if they're adamant, like even if it's like we know it's clear liability, but they're not at fault, and when it's time to like have that come to Jesus moment, they're they're receptive to it. They explain, it's like, look, this is what we have to do. This is why it matters. And then like, okay. And they're trusting. Once they realize you gain their trust and you have that, they come around. I think it takes a while, that first, meeting.
Yeah.
But once they get to it and they trust you and they trust you.
So you can't just have a 30-minute meeting right before the deposition.
No, Lord, no.
Here's how it goes.
So in jury selection, particularly in a region like this, where you probably have fluent Spanish speakers, you have English speakers, you have everything in between. I imagine people on jury. So you're doing voir dire, right? How do you gauge someone's true ability to comprehend and speak English? Because I would imagine some jurors do the Sammy Sosa, like, no habla inglés, right? Do you remember the Sammy Sosa's testimony? Like all of a sudden he forgot everything because they don't want to be here. But then you may get a juror, they essentially, the judge says, can you understand and speak English? And they go, yep. Like, and maybe they don't. How do you gauge somebody's ability to, because imagine if you're putting on particularly a complex case, right?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff, it's hard for anybody to understand, much less somebody that maybe is only halfway there on actual English. How do you I guess assess the various jurors on their ability to really, because it's two factors.
Sure.
It's the comprehension and the speaking. And like you're saying earlier, some people, I remember I was taking Italian. I took Italian in college, which I got through somehow, which is similar to Spanish. I could hear it. I could comprehend it.
Yeah.
And I could read it and I could write it. I just couldn't say it, right? So like, how do you assess potential jurors in that regard? Because you can imagine they go to deliberations. If they haven't been able to understand half your case, that's not a good thing.
Well, and well, you sort of said it. You brought up the Sammy Sosa. Like every single juror, and at least here in El Paso, you get like three people. First, you get like one person who says, "I don't speak." It's like, "No hablo inglés, no hablo inglés." And then like you hear like basically you got like the followers. I'm like, "Oh, that's my ticket."
They all know how to get out of jury duty, right? Yeah.
And some judges are better at that than others, but then like you start. I mean, I would hope at least the best thing that we always do, because we're always creative, like the silent assassin. We literally go through every single one and we're talking to them, even if it's something basic. It's just gonna
quiet
be like,
ones that get you.
Yeah.
it's a 30-minute conversation or 30-second conversation with the the prospective juror. You get a sense, and I'm like, and if they say they didn't understand what you say, and you're like, okay, well I'm like, Judge, can we bring like juror number 28 so we can talk with her, because I don't think they understand it. That's really the way to do it. Like, you really have to we're a big proponent of doing individual voir dire and like trying to go.
Yeah, it's just out of curiosity, because we've done several cases in El Paso, but I wouldn't say a lot of work.
Yeah.
Is someone that struggles with the language barrier, is that pretty much an automatic cause challenge from the bench? Or some jurors are like, no, this is a member of our community, and if he's halfway or she's halfway on English, then that's it. You have to maybe spend a peremptory strike. How does the bench see it?
Well, the standard is, can you read and write English? Like, that's, and understand it. Like, those are like the three things, and they really stress that it. Well, before they even send you to us, they're supposed to be screening you. They're supposed to be screening you, pre-screen you, and anybody who like falls through the cracks, which it does. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. We really do try to like we ask them, we talk to them in English. Like, clearly we have to talk to them in English, because we can't, like, first of all, the record's not going to be in Spanish. Like, we have to talk to them in English and really assess if they understand or not. I'll use my dad again as an example. He was picked as a juror like 3 times, and he, like I said, he struggles communicating it, but he clearly understands it. And he was like, all right, yeah, what's going on? So he did it. Yeah.
But I guess it depends kind of where you're at in your strikes, because you may get somebody like that. You're like, it's impossible for this person to be the foreperson. They cannot hurt my case. Why am I gonna strike them? Right? I mean, it's, I don't know, it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, like I mean, there might be another reason why you want to strike them, but like maybe not necessarily because of that. Because that may ultimately, depending on the circumstances and what their answers are, you may want that person on there. Like, hey, like this guy's gonna relate to our guy, or you know what, that guy's gonna relate to the plaintiff so much. I think they're like from the same neighborhood. You know, no, never mind. Like, no.
Well, I think that leads to a question when you talk about relating to. I mean, obviously, I live outside of Houston, which is a lot different than El Paso. I mean, have you noticed? I think that's another concern, maybe not necessarily in El Paso, but when you go to other places, when we talk about what do you do in voir dire to try to identify jurors who, right, wrong, or indifferent, are going to be upset when they have a witness up there or someone or a defendant up there who doesn't speak English. Then you have a lot of these preconceived biases and all these types of things about people who don't speak English, and then essentially they're going to take it out on the witness or take it out on the defendant. I mean, how do you screen for that in voir dire? Do you ask questions about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I was a defense on that case, so I obviously wanted the people who were going to hold it against it on the panel.
Yeah.
But if I was in the other way, I was like, listen, my client does not speak English. Speaks Spanish speaking, and I'm sorry, who's gonna hold that against them? And then like you go that, and then like literally, I mean, you're gonna get like 3 or 4, but then you really have to go like, again, juror number 2, I'm sorry, I have to ask this, are you gonna hold it against him because he doesn't speak English?
Yeah.
And then like you really got to see their eyes, because it's, again, you don't want that silent.
They're not going to say, yeah, I'm going to hold it
Well,
against them.
right.
Right.
It
You
goes-
know, it's a, yeah.
It goes back to a social desirability
Yeah.
bias, right? Like we've talked about before on the podcast and written about is, people know that, gee, I better not say out loud that I'm going to hold it against somebody who can't speak English. But that's why you got to be paying attention to the nonverbal behaviors and all the other things to say that they might be saying, yeah, I won't hold it against them. But the truth of the matter is
they're
gonna
going to hold it
against
against them. And it's
Yeah.
like, and especially like if they've been in the country, like they've been in the country for a long time, they're definitely going to hold it against them. Like, well,
Yeah.
how did you not learn English? I'm like, what are you doing here? And you really got to like really screen that. And sometimes we have to ask the uncomfortable questions and like ask it in a way that makes us sound insensitive, but we really need to weed out who's going to hold it against it. Yeah.
No.
Let's get to some more real fun questions here. Tell us about your background. Where are you from, and how in the world did you decide that you want to be a trial attorney at law firms?
Well, I was born and raised here in El Paso, and really, I wanted to. Once I realized when I was like 11 years old that I was not going to be a professional athlete, I figured, I got to find something else to do.
That's a terrible day in
Yeah.
all
Yeah,
most men's lives, women too.
Yeah.
You get that like, okay, this ain't gonna work out.
It's not working out.
If you were gonna be a professional athlete, what were you gonna be though? This is really
Well, I guess I would have. I mean, I was fairly decent at basketball. Okay, I mean, I was a pretty good shooter, but it's sort of El Paso. I'm tall for El Paso, but I'm like average everywhere else.
let's say the El Paso Rec League.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, and I was really into like the People's Court back then, and that was like. Well, I think we can argue better than some of these. And so like I've always felt like I've always wanted to be in the courtroom. I always wanted to litigate. Maybe not like, that fiery brand, like, Tom Cruise kind of thing, but like, I think I can relate and do my style in a way. So that's kind of, and that's what I've been.
So where did you go to undergrad?
So I went to undergrad here at Texas El Paso, UTEP.
What did you study?
Political science.
So you really want to be in the law.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the only reason I chose political science is because I was first into engineering, and like then like they gave me like homework for like the first day of orientation. And I'm like, well, screw this. My goal is to go to law school. I'm not gonna I'm just trying to like get this. I'm trying to get to law school. I'm not trying to. And so I studied, and I loved it. I actually liked political science, but then I went to law school at University of Michigan. Go Blue. I know.
Okay, now
No,
this took 25 minutes to get. Okay,
Yeah.
so why in the world would you pick such a substandard school?
Yeah. Especially a substandard law school.
Yeah,
Right. Of all
with a
places.
crooked athletic department. But go ahead, it's our podcast. Go ahead, speak freely.
Yeah.
growing up, I was a huge fan of the Fab Five.
Oh, I love where you're
Oh,
going with
this is
Uh,
great. Yeah.
So I
yeah.
really love the Fab Five, and
Yeah.
so like, and I was watching Michigan football. I mean, that was always kind of
Schembechler fan.
yeah, Schembechler, Lloyd Carr, and then so I was watching all them, and so next thing you know, it's like that was sort of my dream school. I couldn't afford it for undergrad, and I was fortunate enough to get accepted for law school.
I
No,
think
no.
that's excellent.
No for the podcast, so we don't get hate mail. University of Michigan is an exceptional law school.
Yes, we're just kidding. We're just kidding about that. Sports fans, I'm not so
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Okay, so I would like, because you know I'm a Tar Heel.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
in 1993, that's what. How old were you when Chris? So when Chris Webber calls the timeout, did I mean like jump out a window, throw a chair?
I mean,
I threw a chair in celebration.
I was 8 years old, and I was
Okay.
trying to like appreciate what was happening, but
I was 19.
I was pretty devastated because I knew it was. I'm like, that's over. I mean, it's over. And first of all, he traveled and they didn't call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
At
if
least-
everybody's seen this. So what happens is, this is hilarious. So I am watching this game in my living room in Florida, and Chris Webb he didn't just travel. He traveled, and I mean dragged the foot like 4 feet. Dean Smith, the legendary, who I named my son after, but
Correct, yeah.
the legend. Dean Smith like jumped up 34 inches off of the floor. I jumped up as high as I could, almost hit my head on my ceiling and came down on my, and the first thing I said was, we're going to lose this game because the refs didn't call the most obvious travel in the history of basketball. And the clock's ticking down. And then did you watch the 30 for 30?
I did, yeah.
Which by the way, which was, which he
felt
did
bad
not
for him.
participate.
Yeah, I felt
in.
bad for him on that. Actually,
And Jimmy, was it Jimmy Black? Is it
Jimmy King.
Jimmy King. Jimmy King was very straightforward with that. But you see him coming down, and there's somebody on the bench doing this on the timeout. So I felt terrible for Weber. Funny enough, for all the hate that he got, I find when he's calling games and he's on the NBA shows. I think he's fantastic.
Oh, for sure.
He's brilliant. I love the way he carries himself, and he's really really smart. But yeah, Michigan, they still don't have those banners up. I guess they're in the basement.
They're in the library, in the Ford Library. Yeah,
I think that they've got to get over this at some point, right? They have to.
Well, I think they were forced to vacate them, right? I think that was a compromise because of the scandal they had.
So here's what we're gonna do right now. So based on so right now today,
Yeah.
if the Fab Five was playing today, pretty much everything they would do today that they did then would be 100% accepted and legal.
Exactly.
There'd be NIL in this thing.
Yeah.
Imagine the Fab Five with NIL money. They'd stay all 4 years because I mean, can you imagine that? And so the same thing happened. We brought this up. You're too young for this, but SMU football got the death penalty.
Yeah.
You know, Eric Dickerson was driving a different Ferrari every day, and they got the death penalty. And everything they did, then if you did now, you're pretty much in the clear.
Well, right, and I think NCAA realized what happened to SMU because of the death penalty, and it's like because I think they were thinking of doing that for Penn State, and they're like.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was like, we're not doing this anymore, guys. We realize what happens if we do. So,
all right, let's end on. Tell us about the firm, the types of cases you handle, the types of cases the firm handles, and maybe end with how much of a pain in the ass it is to work with Carlos Rincon, the leader of this group.
So. Rincon Law Group, we do a lot of 99% of it is civil litigation defense, representing trucking companies that get involved in accidents that get sued. We do obviously the West Texas region all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley and catastrophic stuff in New Mexico, and our cases are wrongful death, catastrophic injuries, TBIs, all the serious stuff. Man. It's never boring. We're thankfully there. And Carlos, he's a great guy to work with. Sometimes he's
an exceptional human being.
He is.
Yes.
And he's really fun to work with. He's hilarious. We do work hard, but we have fun though, and it's never boring. And I love Carlos. I've been there now for like 9 years. So yeah.
He's a great friend. He refuses to come on the podcast. I don't know what he's been invited 17 times. And he just, I don't want to do it. He's just like giving me grumpy old man excuses.
I fear for the podcast though. If it was a podcast of you and Carlos, it'd be just like two grumpy old men. Just
He's a lot older than me. That's good. That's right. But we're both equally as grumpy though. I think you'd never get a word in.
No, I wouldn't.
But he's a very knowledgeable attorney, and he's a really good guy. And I met him on the speaking tour. And we spoke I'm gonna tell the story, Carlos, because I'm forcing him to listen to this. We're supposed to speak together at DRI, and he said, "Listen," and we're together, and he's like, "Listen, I've got 15 slides, a minute a slide. I need 50. It's for an hour present.
Yeah.
He goes, I just need 15. I'm not gonna go over 15 minutes. Okay." He's at like 25 minutes, and he's on slide 4. And this place is like 500 people in downtown Chicago at DRI. And I had to interrupt him. I'm like, dude, I'm like, dude. He's like, oh man, am I going over? I'm like, dude, you're on slide 4. And he goes, I'm just gonna wrap it up here, Dr. Kanasky. So he still has the slides up. So I had to go close out his presentation, open up mine, and he's just gonna put his hands up in the air. But I guess that's the way it goes. But he's a fantastic attorney.
so Oscar though. Speaking of fantastic attorneys, if anybody needs help, anybody wants to reach out,
Yes,
how do they get a hold of you? What email or what do they got to do to get a hold of you?
a lot of trucking clients listen to this podcast.
Absolutely. They can email us or email me, Lara, OLARA, at Rincon Law Group, RINCON lawgroup.com, and call our office number 915-532-6800.
Are you on LinkedIn?
I don't have LinkedIn.
Oh.
They
What the
can call
hell's
myself.
wrong with
They
you?
can
Yeah.
call myself because we're 24 hours. So yeah.
Yeah.
915-929-9232.
I'm gonna text you at 3:00 in the morning.
Yeah,
just to-
he's 24
I wanna
hours.
lie.
I will be awake.
Yeah.
I'm an early riser, so I shall respond.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is absolutely fantastic, and I would love to have you on again. I think we're gonna. I think for the second half of this year, we're gonna try to. I think I'd like to have multiple attorneys on and get one or two topics and get different perspectives. Maybe people in different parts of the country, because these issues are very different depending on where, like you said, venue.
Yeah.
Everything's different. Like even this Hispanic issue, I deal with it in Florida, and you have a combination of Puerto Rican, Haitian, Cuban, huge Cuban, and then we have Mexicans too, and they're very, very different people. Like so,
Absolutely.
if you don't understand that, it's very challenging. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Definitely enlightening. Definitely learned something. So I appreciate you coming on, Oscar. This has been another edition of Litigation Psychology Podcast brought to you by Courtroom Sciences.
That's it.